G'day everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Wholesome Heathen. I'm Jonny Helwinter, and today I'm going to be explaining to you why I identify as a Slytherin. Let's get started. Okay, so I just want to start out by saying that for us, the world of Harry Potter and the extended world that is being built around it constantly is an entity within and of itself, and that we completely divorce the world and the characters that we love from the author. So we don't support J.K. Rowling, and we don't condone her hatred and her bigotry, obviously. But we also didn't want to make a video that could potentially offend people by discussing the world that she created without first addressing the fact that she is a transphobe and an incredibly problematic person, and we do not support that. So on a personal note, I think that in the book, Slytherin House got done incredibly dirty. The only other house that cops it quite as much is Hufflepuff, and even then it's more through neglect, but then they also got Cedric Diggory, so it kind of evens out. Okay, I also want to say that I think the entire house system is inherently flawed, and that I actually think that Michael Schubert of the Potterless podcast had the best interpretation of the house system and the sorting system, in that the sorting hat doesn't necessarily place a student into the house that portrays a characteristic that they already inherently have, but rather places them in a house where they will be able to realize the potential of a potentially underlying characteristic that is yet to be fully realized, and where they have the most potential for growth. I think that's a really nice way of looking at it, rather than just saying you're brave, you go to Gryffindor, you're smart, you go to Ravenclaw, you're loyal, so you go to Hufflepuff, and you're evil, you go to Slytherin. With the incredibly rare exception of Andromeda Tonks, we don't actually see any examples in the book series about any good Slytherins. They're all evil. They're all bad girls and bad boys, and I'm sure that there were, evil NBs and evil trans folks as well, but Queen Turf wouldn't want to mention them, so we just pretend they don't exist. Okay, so please do not come at me with Snape. He is a terrible person, and I know that there are a bunch of, YouTube videos and podcasts and articles talking about the duality of his nature and how he's very complex and everything. Again, I've got to agree with Michael Schubes on this, in that I think most of the evils of Snape's character are forgiven somewhat by the movie watchers, because he was played by the incomparable Alan Rickman, who was just inherently likable and thus made Snape a more likable character. Also, a lot of the, bullying and psychotic or sociopathic behavior he displayed in the books wasn't portrayed in the movies. So we didn't get to see that side of him. He carried his childhood obsession with one girl against whom he used racial slurs well into his 40s. He is the most stunted, immature man-child in the entire series, and I say that knowing that James Potter exists. But I will say this in defense of James Potter: even though he was a Gryffindor, and even though, yes, he was a bully, he was able to overcome and change. At the end of the day, when the fucking wizard Nazis rocked up, he was fighting them, not joining them. He died fighting wizard Nazis, and Snape joined them. End of story. So, this is the last thing I'm going to say about Snape. Double agent this, the power of love, that blah. All of these excuses made for his terrible behavior, because at the end of the whole thing, he was the bravest wizard that Harry ever knew. It's bullshit. He psychologically terrorized students. He was a bad teacher, for one. Again, broken down on the Potterless podcast. They will be the shout-out this week, so stick around for the end. Broken down, across the entire book series, we see examples of Snape not only being a bad person, but actually being a bad teacher. We know for a fact that he wanted to be Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, but was foisted with the Potions Master position because he happened to be very good at potions, or exceptionally good at potions. And the fact that he didn't embrace that talent more and make, more of a let it have a more positive impact on his life, and he kept pining for this one job position that Dumbledore kept denying him, again just goes to show his inability, his inflexibility, his immaturity. He bullied teenage students. That's it. That's the be all and end all. Like, this is the reason, like, reason numero uno why he should have been fired. He straight up bullied students. You cannot, in the real world, in this real world that we live in, imagine a scenario whereby a grown man in his 40s who teaches at a high school has as many verbal and sometimes physical interactions with students in such a negative way that doesn't end with that student, or with that teacher rather, being pulled up and either suspended or straight up fired from the school. Like, the way he makes fun of Hermione's teeth, the way he terrorizes Neville Longbottom. Think about it this way. Neville Longbottom is 13 years old in The Prisoner of Azkaban, and when the Boggart comes out of the closet, the thing that he is afraid of most in the world is Snape. And I realise that very, very quickly that situation is turned around and it's made to be very funny and we all have a laugh. Especially in the movie, it seemed like Alan Rickman had a lot of fun with it. Everyone had a lot of fun with it. But think about it this way. Everyone else's fears were things like snakes or spiders or clowns. You know, things that kids are normally afraid of. Things that kids should be afraid of. With Harry, with his trauma, obviously Lupin had his concerns that he was going to be afraid of Voldemort and that was going to pop out and not be good for anyone. Fair point. In reality, Harry's greatest fear was Dementors. Also not a great thing, but, you know, that's a bit of a character thing for Harry on the side. What no one seems to pay attention to is the fact that Neville's greatest fear as a 13-year-old boy is one of his teachers and a prominent adult in his life. That, under any other circumstances, would be grounds for the greatest amount of suspicion in the world, and yet it is not looked into at all. Snape was an abusive child abuser. That's it. We've cleared the air about Snape and my feelings about Snape. Let's talk about the rest of the Slytherins in the book series, in that there are very few, and that they are all bad. We get a little bit more time with Horace Slughorn towards the end of the series, and I'd say he is a slightly more interesting character, but in terms of, you know, we don't get that much actual page time with him, and the times we do see him, he is either being shady or showing nepotism, and obviously, like, you know, the twin characteristics of Slytherin are always shown to be ambition and cunning, and it would appear that he has used all of his cunning to achieve and further his ambitions of being well connected. So really it is just par for course with Slughorn, and even though he's not straight up wizard Nazi, you know, it is difficult to make an argument that he could be considered as one of the good characters, as rather one of the morally ambiguous characters. So yeah, that's Slughorn. Obviously, the other character that we spend more page time with, who is from Slytherin, is Draco Malfoy, and I have to say I was incredibly disappointed with his arc as a character. When I first started reading the books as a kid, I was very excited by Draco just because he represented something I immediately identified as a Slytherin as a kid, just because I think you know, my experiences and the way I viewed the world, even as a young kid, led me to see the logic and the pragmatism in the way Slytherins got about their business. And although I inherently hated and rebelled against the bullying that seemed to be represented by all the Slytherin characters, I always saw the potential for great character development in Draco, because as, you know, as a muggle born myself, I suppose, you know, as someone, you know, as a kid reading these books and experiencing them from the muggle world, and, you know, wanting so badly to have gone to Hogwarts and be a wizard, the idea of a character who was born into the wizarding world and would have so much access to all this magical knowledge and sort of just it be part of his entire bloodline, not that bloodlines matter at all, but, you know, the fact that magic was such a part of his life from an early age. For me, I thought that was so interesting. Like, surely they're going to do something really interesting with him, and the fact that he was so two-dimensional or even one-dimensional in the first couple of books, he was just the bully. And to see him have so little growth over the course of the books, with maybe the exception of Half-Blood Prince, and even then I think potentially the movie might have done a better job of showing than telling with that. Yeah, I think the fact that his entire character arc basically boiled down to he was a bully who was exposed as a coward, who then went on to be like a cowardly bully. It's just frustrating. It's incredibly frustrating. So I've come before you today to explain to you why I identify as a Slytherin. And why, even though that may seem counterintuitive to everything I represent here as the wholesome heathen, it isn't. It's just an aspect of my personality that I identify strongly with, even though it doesn't seem to gel with the rest of my personality. So let's delve a little bit further into that. Alright, so the two most common traits associated with Slytherin, as we said before, are cunning and ambition, which in themselves aren't necessarily bad things, but when you pair that with like a lack of empathy or compassion, blatant nepotism, bigotry, racism, when all of these things are combined with cunning and ambition, all you're going to get are bad characters. It explains why, like, the classic line, like, not a bad wizard that didn't come out of Slytherin sort of thing. It sort of explains that, like, there's a culture within Slytherin that sort of promotes these incredibly problematic and unhealthy ways of thinking, that they use the cunning and ambition motto of their house as an excuse for their actions, rather than realizing that there are more to those characteristics than what they're allowing. So I speak at length with my darling wife Jess about how my life would have been had I attended Hogwarts. What my life at Hogwarts would have been like. And funnily enough, she identifies as a Ravenclaw, and she is now a university lecturer. So sometimes the stereotypes and tropes turn out to work out. But I'm eternally grateful that I found my Hermione Granger, even if she was in the wrong house. But when we talk about how I would have been as a young Slytherin at Hogwarts, we joke and laugh about the fact that I would have constantly been at odds with the rest of my house. And that there would have been more than one occasion where, had I been a student at Hogwarts in Slytherin while Severus Snape was the head of Slytherin House, I most likely would have been either suspended or expelled, because the way Slytherins are represented in the books would have made me call them out constantly for their bullshit. And the fact that we're all in Slytherin means that most likely it would have gone to an elevated level, and by that I mean violence. And I would like to talk now about an aspect of Slytherin that sometimes is implied, always in a negative way, that I think we don't talk about enough in the positive light, and that is that, like, when you have cunning and ambition, sometimes a side effect or a byproduct of those two things can be ruthlessness, and I'd like to talk to you now about ruthlessness. I think one of the most often overlooked and often just implied aspects of Slytherin is their ruthlessness. And because we only see bad Slytherins or evil wizards who came from Slytherin using evil means to achieve their goals, and using ruthlessness as a way to achieve their goals and ambitions, it is often portrayed, at least in the books and in terms of themes, that ruthlessness is the flip side, the sort of dark side of the coin of, like, the Gryffindor's sort of mercy, this honourable mercy. And I maintain something different. I maintain that you can be mercifully ruthless and ruthlessly merciful, and it is all about intention. I understand that a lot of my ideals and a lot of the things that I present here on The Wholesome Heathen seem to be fit in much better with the ideals and morals of Hufflepuff House, and to a certain extent I have to agree in the way that they're presented in the books. Absolutely, even in the extended universe, as Hufflepuff was sort of given more range rather than just being the house for all the rest of them, the leftovers, they were given more personality, and a lot of the stuff that I hold dear, a lot of, like, very wholesome stuff seems to fit in with that Hufflepuff mentality. But at the end of the day, Hufflepuffs, Gryffindors, and Ravenclaws, as far as I'm aware, because again, Ravenclaw is another criminally underrepresented house, all the other houses will act within a sort of a moral code that is set and structured and works within the existing structure. It's like a Hufflepuff will do what is right. A Hufflepuff will be wholesome and do the right thing, as long as it falls within, like, the legal or moral standards that they've established in this world. But guess what I'm saying is, at the end of the day, no matter how wholesome they are, a Hufflepuff would not punch a Nazi. Alright, so it does suck, like, identifying so strongly with the house that produces the people that need punching. But I also recognize the inherent irony in that, being that I am myself like a straight cishet white male, and I reap the privilege. I reap the fruits of my privilege every day, whether consciously or subconsciously, unconsciously, what have you. And the fact that I even recognize my privilege, and I'm not looking for praise, I think this is something that needs to be taught in schools, and I'm not just talking about Hogwarts, I'm talking about real ass, schools in the real world need to be teaching this stuff. The fact that I recognize my privilege and want to do something about social injustices in the world would put me at odds with basically every Slytherin that we meet in the Harry Potter universe, and that sucks. Alright, so I want to just spend a second just talking about do good ruthlessly, because this sort of came about as a joke. I was having with Jess. We're both massive fans of The Adventure Zone, which is a Dungeons & Dragons podcast created by the McElroy brothers. And the phrase or the motto, do good recklessly, was coined by Travis McElroy to describe the actions of his character Magnus in this D&D campaign. And I really loved that. I really grew attached to that, and I sort of adopted it as sort of my own motto and my own sort of wholesome philosophy. And over time it has morphed into something more, but the whole do good ruthlessly sort of came about because of do good recklessly, and that's why I've included both of them in the motto for this show. So I was explaining to Jess that the whole idea of doing good recklessly appeals to me because the idea of doing something entirely for someone else with no thought of the harm it could do to me or the benefit I could stand to gain from it appeals to me. And while it is an incredibly noble idea, I feel like it's also incredibly chaotic. And so the idea of doing good ruthlessly came to me. I think it is a reflection of the darker side of my personality that while I want to achieve wholesome ends, I recognize that it is only through struggle and through honesty and through true ruthless redemption that we can achieve like a peaceful unity. The struggle to achieve this peaceful unity will require ruthlessness. Do good, even if it hurts you. Tell the truth, even when it sucks. Brook no argument with those whose worldview holds any form of hatred at its core, be it racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, or bigotry in any of its nefarious shapes, forms, and sizes. At the end of the day, I want to see a better world. I hope for a better world. I want to see a future where we can see humanity return to living in a more harmonious balance with nature, and where human beings don't suffer indignity and loss at the hands of one another. But there are those, and they seem to be a growing group, who see that idealistic utopia, this idea that humanity can all be equal and have a greater understanding of our place on the grand stage of the cosmos, and they're threatened by it. And so they turn to hate and hateful ideologies. And they use this hate and this fear to try and do harm, or to wish harm in the future upon entire groups of people so that they can maintain a status quo that they see benefits them and only them, and that is their right. It is not. These are the people that need to have a Slytherin's ruthlessness taken to them. I believe in reform. I have to. I myself am a reformed racist and homophobe, and that is a ruthless truth that I have to live with every day, and I try and make up for it whenever and wherever I can. I believe that reform should always be the first option offered, but that reform must be ruthless. It must lay bare the manipulations and lies that led them to their hateful beliefs. It must force them to be honest with themselves about why they let their fears become hatred. It must insist that reform is a constant and evolving process where every day you try just a little bit harder to be better than you were the day before. And it insists that you always be asking yourself, can I be more compassionate? Can I be more kind? Whew. Okay, that was really serious, but if I can tie this very briefly back to the Harry Potter series, I'd like to take a moment to talk to you about Regulus Arcturus Black, RAB. We're going to talk very briefly about Sirius's brother Regulus, who I think is a much more interesting good guy Slytherin than Snape, even though he isn't necessarily represented as much or as such in the books. Regulus joined the Death Eaters. He joined the wizard Nazis and most likely was complicit or actually took part in hate crimes, which, obviously I'm not in support of and I cannot defend those actions. What I will say though is that as a reformed bad guy, he presents a more interesting good guy than Snape, who was just acting as a double agent, even if it was for entirely selfish means. And that Regulus's redemption was so dramatic that he actually went so far as to try and undermine Voldemort completely by trying and failing, unfortunately, to destroy a Horcrux, which in turn, by stealing the Horcrux, made it more difficult for Harry and inadvertently led to Dumbledore having to drink the potion and weaken himself to the point that he was unable to defend himself on the tower. But all that aside, Regulus tried to do the right thing, and his representation of reform, I think, is much more symbolic of Slytherin and our symbol, the snake, than Severus, the double agent. So let's just talk a minute to talk about the snake. It's the Slytherin house symbol. Obviously, there's a giant basilisk underneath the castle, and that's sort of, a monster. But snakes in general, and in the Harry Potter world, and just in Western sort of symbology, are coded as evil almost constantly. And there are some falsehoods in that I would like to represent. So often snakes are a symbol of duplicitousness or maliciousness, quite often being underhanded and sneaky. And in Western Christian mythology, the snake is actually representative of the devil himself. With that in mind, I think it's worth mentioning that snakes have not always been seen this way. In fact, in a lot of pre-Christian and I'd say just non-Western cultures, snakes represented something much more benevolent, and that is healing and rebirth. The Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, is a symbol of fertility and rebirth, and snakes themselves represent the natural cycle of life, being birth, death, rebirth. The idea of a snake being able to shed its skin and be reborn fresh and new is, to my mind, a much better representation of the process of reform and the constant effort we have to make to better ourselves. To resist this change, to deny that the skin that you're currently wearing will eventually change and grow as the person that you are inside changes and grows, is the very essence of what Voldemort and his Nazi wizards represent, and is in fact antithetical to the very symbol of Slytherin, the snake. And to this I say, Voldemort and the Death Eaters are bad Slytherins. The symbol of the serpent that we proudly bear represents constant change and self-improvement, rather than stagnation and an unwillingness to accept the natural order of the world. I believe in reform, but there are some who are beyond it, or act in a way that makes it seem like that is the case. During a recent protest against the COVID restrictions here in Victoria, a bunch of idiots, effectively, gathered around at the Shrine of Remembrance, where we as Victorians and as a nation, Australia, remember those who have fought and died in the wars of the past. And they threw Nazi salutes. There are photographs and there are footage of people who were attending this protest, and they were Sieg Heiling at the Shrine of Remembrance. The level of just how unacceptable that is cannot be understated. To me, as a Slytherin and a social justice wizard, I would like to see those assholes get hurt. Not in a permanent way, and certainly not in a way that would increase the already overwhelming physical intimidation that the police have over civilians. But rather, just in my snaky heart of hearts, I would have liked to have seen one random hero emerge from the crowd and just beat the living Christ out of one of those people throwing a Nazi salute. That salute represents one of, if not the most violent ideologies in the world and in the history of the world. It represents violence on a scale far beyond a punch-up or a brawl. It represents violence on the scale of eradication. It represents violence on the scale of erasure of cultures. It represents violence in terms of Holocaust and apocalyptic levels. I can't help but feel that when a declaration of violence like that is made so publicly, it is the inherent duty of those who seek to do good ruthlessly, to answer in kind. Reform where it is possible, but where it is not, we Slytherins must use our cunning, our ambition, and our ruthlessness to do what is right. And that means punching Nazis, whether in the wizarding world or in the real world. So obviously this week the shout out has to go to Michael Schubert and the Potterless podcast. I started listening to it a couple of years ago when I was doing garden maintenance work, and I was fresh out of episodes of the last podcast on the left and My Favorite Murder, and I was looking for something new to sort of binge. And when I searched Spotify, I didn't really know what I was looking for. I didn't go there with any specific purpose, and it just came up as a recommended one. I thought, I'll give this a crack. What's the premise? It's a grown man reading the Harry Potter books for the first time. And basically, with the introduction episode and Mike sort of explaining, the premise and sort of me getting an idea of his tone as sort of very snarky and snide, I thought, well, this could be an interesting way to re-listen to effectively the Harry Potter series and sort of see it through a more adult lens, rather than having the rose-tinted goggles of childhood nostalgia still firmly placed over my eyes. And as the series progressed, I really appreciated that Mike grew with it. He started out with the first few books being very sarcastic and snide, and maybe by Prisoner of Azkaban, especially when all the big twists were taking place at the end, you could hear in his voice how he was so impressed with the way the story was unfolding. And more than anything, it was his enthusiasm for the books that made me enthusiastic for the books again, or enthusiastic for the world. And of course, he's since gone on to do, episodes. Once he finished the book series, he went on to do, the movies, and he's reviewing games, and basically anything Harry Potter related he is now reviewing on the podcast. But something that I also really appreciated about him was, right from the word go, the podcast was very inclusive, and he recognized his cishet white male privilege. Like, he openly acknowledged, his position, and he strove to get guests on the show to sort of read along with him, or experts, to sort of explain stuff to him as he was going along, who were, it was quite a diverse cast, and I really appreciated that, because there were a lot of perspectives that, being a young straight white dude myself, I'd never really thought of, a lot of perspectives. Obviously there is a very strong, feminist slant, well, not feminist slant, but rather feminist perspective that was brought to the show by having a lot of female guests on, a lot of women or people who identify as female, and having them sort of talk to Shubes about how Harry Potter reads to them through the eyes of a woman. And yeah, I think I just really respected that he gave a lot of people voices who potentially either wouldn't have had a voice, or he amplified voices that weren't being heard. And I respect people who recognize their privilege and understand that when they get a platform like he has, that platform should be used to raise other people up, not to stand above them. So, as incredibly American as he is, and sometimes the way he doesn't understand that there is more to the world than the world that exists in America, he always treats England as if it's as fantastical and otherworldly as Hogwarts itself. And maybe as an Australian, maybe we just still have enough of the coloniness to as a white Australian at least, have enough of the coloniness to sort of understand a lot of the English references that seem to go over his head. For all that, I can't thank him enough for reinvigorating my love of the series and for giving me so many new perspectives on it, and a new way to think about it, and a new way to talk about it. So cheers to Shubes. Definitely check out the Potterless podcast. You won't regret it. It's a lot of fun.